Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
On October 14, 2012, at 10:30 in the morning, 28-year-old Patricia Lawrence disappeared without a trace on mile 60 of the Tahiti Highway. Her gray sedan seemed to disappear into the humid air of the Everglades, leaving no brake marks or glass shards on the hot asphalt. Police and volunteers searched for the body in the alligator canals for exactly 3 years, until the woman was found in the heart of the impenetrable thicket, alive, mute, with madness in her eyes, and a creepy doll made of human hair in her hands, which she refused to let go even under the influence of sedatives. On October 14, 2012, the morning in South Florida was surprisingly stifling even for this time of year. A thick fog that rose from the Everglades swamps enveloped the coastal cities before sunrise. Patricia Lawrence, a 28-year-old architect with an up-and-coming firm in Miami, left her apartment at 6:30 in the morning. Her day was written out minute by minute in the leather diary she always kept on the passenger seat. The woman was known for her meticulousness and punctuality, so she left with plenty of time to spare. Her final destination was the town of Naples on the west coast of the peninsula, where she had a 2 o'clock appointment with a wealthy client to approve a landscaping project. Patricia chose to take the route via U.S. Highway 41, known as the Tahama Trail. It's 275 miles of asphalt cutting through the heart of the Big Cypress National Preserve. Local drivers call this road the Green Tunnel because of the wall of cypress trees and mangroves that hang over the highway. At 9 o'clock, 14 minutes in the morning, CCTV cameras at the toll booth captured her gray sedan. The grainy, low-quality footage shows only the woman's profile. She is staring intently at the road, holding the steering wheel with one hand and adjusting her sunglasses with the other. The car was moving within the speed limit, and traffic was light. Nothing in her demeanor indicated anxiety or haste. It was the last time Patricia Lawrence was seen alive. At 10 o'clock and 30 minutes in the morning, her cell phone connected to a cell tower for the last time. The billing showed that the device was in coverage near the Ochopa Post Office, the smallest in the United States, located in the middle of a swampy wasteland. After this signal, the phone went silent. According to technical expertise, the device was not manually turned off. It most likely lost its network or was destroyed. This section of the highway is known for its dead zones, where communication disappears for tens of miles, but it is usually restored closer to civilization. This time, there was no restoration. When Patricia failed to show up for a meeting in Naples at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the client tried to call her. After 5 long rings, her voicemail went off. The man, irritated by the delay, called the firm's Miami office, but was told that Patricia had left in the morning and would be there on time. By 5 o'clock in the evening, when the sun began to set over the horizon, turning the marshes into a black abyss, the woman's parents raised the alarm. They knew their daughter never disappeared without warning. Dispatcher 911 received the call at 5 o'clock 48 minutes. The Collier County Police Department launched a search operation at 7 o'clock in the evening. Patrol crews moved slowly along the Tamiami Trail, shining high-powered spotlights on the roadside and the dark waters of the canals that stretch along the road. The main version of the investigation at the time was tragic but prosaic: a traffic accident. The Tayama Trail has no bumpers on many dangerous sections. The slightest mistake by the driver, an attempt to avoid a collision with a deer or panther, or simple fatigue could have caused the car to fly off the road. The deep canals along the road are teeming with alligators, and the muddy bottom can swallow a car in minutes, leaving not even an oil slick on the surface. On October 15th, the morning after the disappearance, A group of divers was engaged in the search. The working conditions were critical. Visibility in the water was less than 6 inches. The divers worked virtually blindly, feeling the bottom with their hands among sharp roots and debris. 5 miles of canals were checked within the radius of the last phone signal. The team brought to the surface the rusted wreck of a 70s pickup truck, several old refrigerators, and hundreds of tires, but no sign of Patricia Lawrence's gray sedan. No braking marks on the asphalt. No knocked-down road posts or damaged bushes. The car seemed to have vanished into thin air along with the driver. 48 hours after the disappearance, when the hope of finding Patricia as a result of the accident began to fade, a witness came forward whose words changed the course of the investigation. A 60-year-old truck driver named Earl, who was on his way to Tampa, contacted the police after seeing a report about the missing woman on the evening news. His testimony was recorded in an interrogation report dated October 16, 2012. Earl told investigators that he drove through the Big Cypress Reservation on the morning of October 14 at approximately 10:45 minutes. He distinctly remembered a gray sedan parked on the wide gravel roadside just before the turnoff to the old dirt road, Loop Road. This road, narrow and bumpy, winds through the wildest and most remote areas of the marshes, where tourists are rarely seen. According to the witness, the hood of the car was raised, as if the engine had overheated or broken down. But the most important detail was the other vehicle. Earl said that close to the gray sedan, blocking the exit, was an old, dark green pickup truck. The car was so dirty that the license plates were not visible. The truck driver noticed that someone was standing near the open driver's door of the car, but because of the speed of the car, he could not see the person's face or even gender. He thought that the local resident had stopped to help a girl with a broken car, so he did not slow down. The only thing that stuck in his mind was a blurry spot on the door of a green pickup truck. It resembled the logo of some company, possibly yellow or white, but a layer of dried mud made it impossible to read the name. The detectives immediately went to the location. The turnoff to Loop Road was thoroughly examined by forensic experts. Unfortunately, the heavy tropical downpours that occurred in the area on the evening of October 14th washed away most of the possible evidence. There were no clear identifiable tire prints left on the gravel. No oil drops or traces of antifreeze were found, which could confirm the version that Patricia's car had broken down. However, in the thick grass a few feet from the road, Detective Marcus Vance spotted something that made him hold his breath. It wasn't a car part or a personal item. It was a heavy, muddy boot print that had miraculously been preserved in the mud under a wide fern leaf that protected it from the rain. The size of the shoe was huge, much larger than could have belonged to the frail Patricia Lawrence. On November 3, 2015, exactly 3 years and 19 days had passed since Patricia Lawrence's gray sedan was last seen on a toll road. In that time, her case has gone from an active investigation to a pile of papers in the Collier County Cold Case Archive. Hopes of finding the woman alive melted away in the first weeks of the search. The Everglades swamps do not bring back those who have been taken, as local rangers used to say. However, on Tuesday, deep in the Fakahatchee Strand State Reserve, the story continued in a way that shocked even experienced investigators. The Fakahatchee Strand is a 75,000-acre wilderness, often referred to as the Amazon of North America. Here, among the centuries-old cypress trees growing out of black standing water, is the largest population of ghost orchids in the world. It was to census these rare flowers that a group of 3 biologists traveled to the most remote sector of the park, known as Sector 14. The team leader, Dr. James Miller, later noted in his report that they were 8 miles from the nearest gravel road. The terrain was so impassable that no man had set foot there in the last 10 years. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, as they waded through dense ferns and crossed waist-deep swamps, graduate student Sarah Jenkins noticed something unnatural. She stopped when she heard a strange sound. It wasn't like the roar of a Florida cougar or the roar of an alligator, which are common in these waters. It was a quiet, rhythmic sound, reminiscent of the whimpering of an injured animal or the crying of a child. The group froze, listening to the silence, broken only by the buzzing of mosquitoes. The source of the sound was 50 yards to the east, near a giant oak tree that had been blown down by a hurricane a few years earlier. Its twisted roots had formed a natural wall, hiding a small, dry patch of land surrounded by water. As the biologists approached, they saw a structure that resembled a large animal's lair or nest. It was woven from dry branches, palm leaves, and mud. Inside this primitive shelter, curled up in a fetal position on a bed of moss and rotten rags, sat a creature that was hard to identify as human. It was a woman. Her condition horrified even the medics who arrived later. She was critically emaciated. Her ribs protruded through her parchment-thin skin, covered with a layer of dirt, insect bite sores, and deep scratches. Her hair, once well-groomed, was tangled in one continuous, hard tangle, with branches and leaves tangled in it. She had almost no clothes left on her, just dirty pieces of cloth that might have been a shirt tied in knots around her hips. When Dr. Miller tried to speak to her gently, the reaction was immediate and aggressive. The woman looked up sharply. Her eyes, wide open and filled with animalistic fear, darted from side to side, not focusing on the rescuers. She began to make piercing throat sounds, trying to crawl deeper under the protection of the roots. The biologists noticed that she was clutching something frantically to her chest, protecting it with her own body as if it were the most precious thing she had. The evacuation turned into a complex special operation. Due to the density of the forest, the rescue helicopter could not land. The rescuers had to descend on ropes and lift the woman they found on a stretcher. All the while, she was putting up a fierce fight, scratching and biting, until paramedics were forced to inject her with a strong dose of sedative. At 4 o'clock 15 minutes, the helicopter headed for the physician's hospital in Maples. Already in the emergency room, when doctors began to cut off the remains of the patient's clothes and clean her skin, the terrible truth was revealed. Under a layer of dirt on the woman's left shoulder, they found a distinctive crescent-shaped mole, and on her thigh, an old scar from a childhood surgery. These features were completely consistent with the description in the 3-year-old APB. An emergency DNA analysis conducted the same night confirmed the impossible. The savage from the Fakahatchee swamps was Patricia Lawrence, a successful architect who went missing in October 2012. A medical examination revealed the terrible consequences of a long stay in the wild. Severe dehydration, anemia, parasitic infections, and numerous healed fractures in her fingers and toes that had not fused properly. But the doctors were most concerned about the patient's psychological state. She did not respond to her name, did not understand human speech, and continued to be in a state of deep catatonia, staring at one point on the wall. Her only connection to reality was the object she had so fiercely defended in the swamps, and which the doctors barely managed to remove for examination. It was a doll, a rough, primitive figure that disgusted the entire hospital staff. It was not made of cloth or straw. The doll was tightly woven from human hair long, dark hair that looked like Patricia's own, and held together with a black, sticky substance that smelled like pine resin and swamp sludge. The detective who arrived at the hospital to seize the evidence carefully placed the figurine in a plastic bag. It was heavy and hard to the touch, as if something metal was hidden inside, under the layers of hair. Patricia, who had been lying motionless under the influence of drugs, suddenly opened her eyes. Seeing that the doll was being taken away, she made a clear, meaningful sound for the first time in 3 years. It was not a scream, but a quiet, desperate moan. And her hand reached out to the detective, as if begging him not to take away the only thing that kept her alive. The woman's fingers convulsively clutched the empty sheet, and her gaze froze on the bag of evidence that held the secret of her 3-year hell. Dear friends, before we continue to dive into this gruesome story, I ask you to support the channel. Subscribe, click the bell, like this video, and leave any comments. Your activity helps YouTube's algorithms to promote content so that as many people as possible can learn about these events. Thank you for your support. On November 4th, 2015, a day after the evacuation from the swamps, Patricia Lawrence was transferred to isolated room 402 in the intensive care unit of the physician's hospital. The medical staff immediately encountered the patient's atypical behavior. According to the records of the nurse on duty, Patricia was in a state of deep catatonia. She had been lying in the same position for hours, with her knees pulled up to her chin, staring at a single point. Her muscles were so tense that doctors had to use physical force to open her arm to insert an intravenous drip. Any attempt to turn on a bright light or loud sound in the corridor caused the woman to have an instant panic attack. She began to tremble violently, covered her ears with her palms, and swayed from side to side, making a quiet, monotonous humming sound. A medical consultation, which included neurologists and psychiatrists, diagnosed her with a severe form of post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated by the effects of prolonged sensory deprivation. 3 years in isolation, in the darkness of the swamps, changed her perception of reality. Her brain had forgotten how to filter out the usual stimuli of the modern world. Electric light seemed like a blinding flash, and the sound of a running air conditioner was an unbearable roar. Meanwhile, at the Collier County Crime Lab, Detective Marcus Vance was waiting for the results of the examination of the main piece of evidence, the doll that had been taken from Patricia. The object, wrapped in a sterile bag, disgusted even experienced lab technicians. An expert trichologist, Dr. Sarah Bennett, conducted a microscopic analysis of the fibers from which the doll was woven. The results, obtained at 16 hours and 30 minutes, gave the case a new, ominous color. The outer layer of the doll really consisted of long, dark hair, the DNA structure of which matched the genetic profile of Patricia Lawrence. This confirmed that over the course of 3 years, someone had methodically cut off her hair to use it as a building material. However, when experts began to unravel the figure to examine its structure, they discovered a core. The inside of the doll was formed from a completely different type of hair, stiff, gray, and showing signs of severe sun damage. Preliminary analysis showed that this hair belonged to an elderly woman whose identity remained unknown at the time. During the X-ray scan of the doll, a clear outline of a foreign object hidden in the very center of the plexus appeared on the monitor. Detective Vance authorized an autopsy of the evidence. Carefully cutting through the layers of hair held together by a mixture of pine resin and river silt, the experts pulled out a small metal object. It was a key. It was an old patina-covered brass key, the kind usually used for mailboxes or padlocks. The number 14 was roughly embossed on its head. There were no manufacturer's markings or other identification marks on the key. This discovery was the first real clue that could lead the investigation to the woman's place of imprisonment, but no one knew which door this key unlocked. While forensic scientists were working with the evidence, in room 402, a clinical psychologist, Dr. Eleanor Reed, was trying to establish contact with the victim. Since Patricia refused to talk, the doctor decided to use art therapy. She put a pile of blank paper and a set of charcoal pencils in front of the woman. At first, Patricia ignored the objects, but on the third day of her hospitalization, November 7th, she picked up a pencil for the first time. What she began to draw bore little resemblance to conscious pictures. They were chaotic, sharp strokes. Patricia drew with manic speed, breaking the slates, one sheet after another. She filled the paper with vertical lines that overlapped each other, creating the effect of a thick lattice or tall grass. At the bottom of each drawing, she depicted wavy horizontal lines. Water. By the evening of November 7th, the floor by her bed was covered with dozens of drawings. Dr. Reed, analyzing the patient's art, noticed one common detail that was repeated on every sheet. Over the image of grass and water, Patricia drew a bold, broken line that looked like a cardiogram or a sound wave. She drew the pencil with pressure on the paper until it was torn. When the psychologist cautiously asked, "Patricia, what is it? Is it the wind?" The woman froze. Her hand trembled, and she looked the doctor in the eye for the first time. Then, slowly, as if overcoming the incredible resistance of her own body, she turned the pencil over and drew a circle on a blank corner of the sheet, with a spiral inside it. She tapped her finger on her ear, and then on the broken line drawing. It was not an image of an object. Patricia was drawing a sound that had haunted her in the dark for all 3 years. Silence fell in the room, broken only by the rustling of the paper as the woman began to draw a new detail that made Dr. Reed flinch. The investigation, which had seemed hopeless a week ago, suddenly had physical evidence. A brass key with the number 14 engraved on it. For Detective Marcus Vance, this piece of metal became an obsession. For 5 days, starting on November 8, 2015, he personally visited every cheap motel, every abandoned tourist base, and storage station along the Tahiti Trail. His route ran from the outskirts of Miami to the Everglades swamps. He checked hotel room doors in hotels that had closed in the 90s and tried to find the key to rusty lockers at old gas stations. But it was a dead end. The key did not fit any lock. It had no maker's markings, which made it impossible to trace the place of its manufacture. The forensic team speculated that it could be a key to a private property, a shed, garage, or hunting lodge, of which there are thousands in the South Florida woods. While Vance was studying land maps, nature itself decided to reveal one of its secrets. The fall of 2015 was abnormally dry. The groundwater level in the region dropped to record lows, exposing what had been hidden for years under the dark surface of ponds and quarries. The breakthrough occurred on November 14th, a Saturday, in the Sunnyland area. This is a gloomy industrial zone to the north of the reserve, dotted with old limestone quarries that stopped working half a century ago. Now this place has become a training ground for local teenagers who illegally organize ATV races there. A group of 4 boys, ignoring the warning signs, private property, and dangerous, drove deep into the territory, to a flooded quarry known among the locals as the Black Hole. The water here has always had an unnatural, inky color due to the high content of minerals and silt. One of the teenagers, 17-year-old Tyler, stopped at the edge of the cliff to take a photo. Later, in his statement to police, he said, "The water level dropped 5 or 6 feet. I looked down and saw something sticking out of the water. It looked like an antenna, and there was something shining in the sun, like chrome. The boys went down closer to the water and realized that they were looking at the rear bumper of a car stuck in the silt at a 45-degree angle. Part of the Florida license plate was still on the bumper. The frightened teenagers, realizing that they had found something terrible, immediately called the sheriff. The police arrived at the scene at 2:30 in the afternoon. The area around the Sunnyland quarry was cordoned off with yellow tape. Detective Vance, upon arriving, immediately realized that this could be the answer to a question that had been plaguing him for 3 years. As the powerful tow truck began to pull the cable, the water in the quarry boiled with gas and dirt bubbles. Slowly, with the grinding of metal against stones, a gray sedan covered with a thick layer of algae and river mollusks surfaced. It was Patricia Lawrence's Toyota. The car's VIN confirmed this instantly. The car was inspected right on the shore, under the flashes of forensic cameras. The interior was filled with silt almost to the roof. The driver's side window was down, which explained why the car sank so quickly. The gear lever was in the neutral position. Experts found a large stone under the accelerator pedal, which was apparently used to fix the speed before pushing the car into the water. It was not an accidental fall or an accident. Someone deliberately got rid of the evidence by choosing the deepest spot in the area, hoping that the water would never recede. But the most disturbing discovery was waiting for the investigators in the trunk. The lock was jammed by rust, so the rescuers had to use hydraulic scissors to open the lid. Inside, among the dirt and rusty tools, was a plastic container that had miraculously retained its tightness. When the CSI opened it, Detective Vance felt a chill run down his spine. The container contained neither documents nor Patricia's laptop. It contained things that were completely inconsistent with the image of a career architect. The first item was a package of thick, industrial construction ties, black plastic clamps used to secure cables, or in the worst cases, as handcuffs. Next to it was a set of children's books. They were old, worn editions of fairy tales from the 80s, with bright but somewhat creepy illustrations. Mother Goose's Tales, Alice in Wonderland, and a collection of lullabies. Patricia Lawrence had no children, no nephews of the appropriate age, and was never interested in children's literature. The books were signed with a trembling hand on the flyleaf. For my little princess. This discovery instantly changed the profile of the perpetrator. Dr. Alan Cross, an FBI profiler who was brought into the case after the discovery of the machine, came to a disappointing conclusion. Murder or robbery was not the attacker's primary goal. The construction ties pointed to preparations for prolonged detention of the victim, and the children's books indicated a deep psychological disorder. "We're not just looking for a sadist," Cross said in his report. "We're dealing with a collector. This person creates his own distorted world where the victim has to play a role. The books are a script. He did not perceive Patricia as an adult woman. For him, she was an object, a child or a doll to be brought up and read fairy tales to. He flooded the car not only to hide the evidence, but also to erase her past life, to cut off all ties with reality." The discovery in Sunnyland's quarry gave the investigation new vectors, but at the same time raised even more frightening questions. If the kidnapper wanted Patricia to become part of his fantasy, where was the stage for this performance? The quarries are located far from residential areas, but there were old industrial sites within a 10-mile radius. Vance ordered me to check the origin of the books we found. One of them, on the back cover, bore the stamp of a bookstore that had closed many years ago. But this was not the only clue. When the forensic team pulled out the back seat of the car to check the body cavities, they found a small, crumpled piece of paper under the upholstery. A gas station receipt dated October 13, 2012, the day before the kidnapping. In addition to the amount of fuel, the receipt bore the time and address: Alligator Hook Bait and Tackle Shop. It was a place on the very edge of civilization, rarely visited by casual drivers. On November 17, 2015, at 3:15 in the morning, the silence in Ward 402 was broken by a barely audible whisper. The nurse on duty who was making her rounds later noted in her report that she had initially mistaken the sound for ventilation noise. Patricia Lawrence was awake. She was sitting on her bed, wrapping her arms around herself, rocking back and forth rhythmically. Her eyes were fixed on the window, outside which a typical Florida fall thunderstorm was raging. When the thunder struck, the woman shuddered with her whole body. But instead of the usual scream or panic attack, she clutched the sheet with her white fingers and spoke a single word clearly. She repeated it 3 times, raising her voice each time until the whisper turned into a hoarse moan. Rumble. It was the first verbal communication from the victim in 2 weeks of hospitalization. Dr. Eleanor Reed arrived at the hospital at 6 o'clock in the morning. During an emergency session, the psychologist tried to find out the nature of the word. Patricia couldn't explain it in sentences, but pointed to her drawings, the same broken lines that overlapped the image of water. After an hour of painstaking work, Dr. Reed came to a conclusion that was key to the investigation. The word rumble did not refer to the thunder outside the window. It was a description of a constant, monotonous mechanical noise that accompanied the woman for all 3 years of her imprisonment. She heard it day and night, and it penetrated the walls of her dungeon, becoming her only reference point in time. Patricia made it clear that the sound was deep, vibrating, and never stopped, like the heartbeat of a giant metal beast. Detective Marcus Vance received the psychologist's report at 9 o'clock in the morning on November 18th. He immediately realized that this was a chance to narrow down the search area. The Everglades are a realm of silence, where the soundscape consists mainly of birds crying, wind noise, and water splashes. The constant industrial din in such an area is an anomaly. Vance asked acoustic engineers at the University of Florida to create a sound map of the region. The specialists overlaid data on all active industrial facilities within a 50-mile radius of the site where Patricia was found on the map of the reserve. The results of the analysis were received on November 19th. Most noise sources, highways or airports, produced intermittent sound. The only object capable of generating a continuous low-frequency vibration that could be heard for miles across the water was the old Titan Quarry. It is located on the northern edge of the Big Cypress Nature Reserve, just 7 miles from the impenetrable mangrove forest. There was a giant limestone crusher working around the clock, turning rock into crushed stone. The rumble from its millstones, reflecting off the surface of the water, could spread through the channels for a considerable distance, creating the effect of a constant background hum. With a new area of interest, the investigation team focused on a sector of marshland that was within earshot of the crusher. It was an area of about 20 square miles, completely covered with mangrove islands and a maze of narrow channels. There were no land roads. No one in their right mind would build a home there. However, Patricia was painting walls and a roof, which meant that she was not being kept in the open air. Vance brought in geospatial intelligence analysts to study archival and modern satellite imagery of the area. The work was exhausting. Everything on the images merged into a solid green and brown mass. But on November 20th, while looking at the footage taken in the infrared spectrum, the analyst noticed an unnatural geometric shape in the depths of one of the straits, which the locals called Snake Creek. Among the chaotic lines of nature, a perfect square stood out clearly. It did not look like an ordinary hunting lodge or a poacher's platform. The object stood on stilts in the middle of the water, completely cut off from the land. A check of cadastral maps and military archives revealed an unexpected history of this structure. It was Hydrological Station 9, a concrete platform with a technical room built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers back in the 70s to monitor water levels in the swamps. According to official documents, the station was decommissioned after the devastating Hurricane Andrew in 1992. It was listed as destroyed and dismantled in the registers. No one had checked its condition for over 20 years because it was only accessible by flat-bottomed boat, knowing the exact fairway among the treacherous routes. On November 21st, Detective Vance organized an aerial reconnaissance using a drone so as not to scare away possible residents of the station with the noise of the helicopter. The drone's operator raised the device above the treetops 3 miles from the site. A picture appeared on the monitor screen that took the entire group's breath away. Station 9 had not been destroyed. Concrete piles held a one-story structure with a sloping roof firmly above the black water. The building looked like a ghost from the past, overgrown with moss and vines, becoming part of the swamp. However, there were details that indicated that this ghost had not been abandoned. The roof had been carefully repaired with sheets of rusty iron and palm branches to hide it from view from above. The windows were tightly boarded up from the inside, turning the room into a dark box. And most importantly, an old aluminum boat covered with camouflage netting stood on a rickety wooden dock attached to a concrete base. But the final piece of evidence that made Vance immediately request an assault warrant was a detail that the drone's camera captured at maximum zoom. A massive padlock hung on the front door, which was padded with felt for soundproofing. It was new, shiny, with no traces of rust. And it was the same type of lock that the brass key with the number 14 found inside the human hair doll could fit. The house on the water was waiting for guests. The operation, codenamed Quiet Water, began on November 22, 2015, at 4:30 in the morning. The Special Response Team, consisting of 12 soldiers in full tactical gear, moved to monitoring Station Number 9 on 3 silent boats with electric motors. The thick pre-dawn fog played into the hands of the operatives, hiding their approach to the object that was marked on the maps as a ruin, but in reality turned into a fortress in the middle of the swamp. At 5 hours and 15 minutes, the group took up positions on a rickety wooden pier. The assault began without warning. Using hydraulic scissors, the fighters cut the shackle of a brand-new padlock on the front door. A second later, the door was smashed open with a battering ram, and stun grenades flew inside. A loud explosion shook the silence of the mangroves, followed by clear commands. "Police! On the floor!" However, there was only silence in response. 2 minutes later, the team commander, Lieutenant Garcia, radioed in a Code 4, which meant the facility was clear, no suspects inside. But the house was not empty. What the detectives saw when they entered after the SWAT team made even police veterans feel nauseous. Inside, there was not the expected devastation of a hermit's lair, but an eerie, manic cleanliness. The floor was washed to a shine, not a single speck of dust on the furniture. All the windows were tightly boarded up from the inside, with thick boards caulked with felt, which created an eternal thick gloom in the room, dispelled only by the rays of police lights. The air was heavy, full of the smell of pine resin, old wax, and something sweet, like incense. The walls of the main room had been transformed into an exhibition of madness. Dozens of braids woven from human hair hung on perfectly straight nails. They were sorted by length and shade, from dark, almost black, to light blonde. Each braid was tied with a thin black ribbon. It resembled hunting trophies, but instead of deer antlers, there were parts of people hanging there. Among them, the detectives recognized long, dark hair that resembled Patricia Lawrence's hair in structure. In the far corner of the house was a heavy door locked with a massive bolt from the outside. When Detective Vance pushed the deadbolt open, he entered a room that had been a prison for the missing woman for 3 years. This 6-by-8-foot room had no furniture, except for a thin mattress on the floor. But that was not the most frightening thing. All 4 walls, from floor to ceiling, were covered with drawings made with pieces of charcoal. Patricia turned her cell into a chronicle of madness. Hundreds, thousands of black lines overlapped each other. There were images of eyes looking everywhere, the sketchy outline of the same green pickup truck, and endless wavy lines of water. In the corner of the room was a mountain of blanks branches, wrapped in rags and clumps of hair, ready to be used to create new dolls. On the floor was a bowl of dried wood resin, the same substance that had held together the figurine found in the woman's hands during the rescue. In the main room, on a table arranged with surgical precision, the investigators found the answer to the question, who? There was a stack of documents folded into a flat pyramid. These were old payrolls, tax returns, and a dismissal order dated 2008. The name on the papers was Silas Reed. The dossier, which analysts instantly picked up, painted a portrait of the perfect invisible man. Silas Reed, 45 years old, a former crusher operator at the Titan Quarry. He was fired for strange behavior and systematic safety violations. He spent hours talking to the machinery and brought women's hair to work that he had collected from hairdressers. Next to the documents was a kind of altar. On a lace napkin, which looked grotesque in this gloomy place, was a black and white photograph of an elderly woman with a stern face and incredibly long gray hair braided into a complicated hairstyle. It was Martha Reed, Silas's mother, who died in 2010. In front of the photo was a silver hairbrush full of gray hairs. Experts immediately recognized them. They were the same stiff gray hairs that made up the core of the Patricia doll. Profiler Alan Cross, having examined the crime scene, concluded, Silas Reed did not just kidnap a woman. He was looking for a replacement for his late mother, whose cult he professed in his sick imagination. He forced Patricia to play the role of a silent companion, an idol who was supposed to sit in the dark and listen to his confessions. The doll he made her make was the physical embodiment of this connection. The hair of the victim on the outside, but the essence of a mother on the inside. He was trying to turn a living woman into an object without will or voice, as obedient as the things in his immaculately cleaned house. The search had been going on for 2 hours when one of the officers called Detective Vance into the kitchen. An old enamel kettle stood on the perfectly clean stove. The operative reached out but did not touch the metal, only raised his palm. The kettle still gave off tangible heat. The water inside was hot. Silas Reed had not left this place days or weeks ago. He was here, in this house, drinking tea and possibly combing through his mother's hair less than an hour before the SWAT team kicked down the door. He heard the boats approaching. He wouldn't have time to get far on a boat without being caught by a drone. Vance walked to the back door, which opened onto a dense thicket of reeds, and saw a wet, barefoot print on the floor, pointing outward. The footprint had not yet dried. The owner of the sanctuary was somewhere nearby, in the water, watching the strangers destroy his world. On November 22, 2015, at 7:40 in the morning, the police departments of 3 South Florida counties Collier, Miami-Dade, and Monroe were put on high alert. The escape of Silas Reed turned the investigation into a massive manhunt that was broadcast on all national TV channels. Helicopters with thermal imagers were ironing the air over the mangroves, and Coast Guard boats were blocking the exits to the Gulf of Mexico. However, the Everglades is 1.5 million acres of water, grass, and silt. And for a man who has lived here all his life, it is the perfect hiding place. Silas Reed knew every creek, every shoal, and he disappeared like an alligator diving into muddy water, leaving no ripples on the surface. Detective Marcus Vance, standing by the map in the mobile headquarters, realized one thing that the federal agents were ignoring. The FBI was looking for a fugitive who would try to cross state lines or lay low in a big city. But Reed's psychological profile, compiled by Dr. Alan Cross, said otherwise. The man was a reclusive sociopath. The noise of the metropolis, crowds of people, and modern technology frightened him more than armed special forces. His world was limited to the swamp. His comfort zone was silence, the smell of rotten wood, and isolation. Vance was sure Reed would not go north. He would stay here, in his warped kingdom, watching the hunters from the reeds. Meanwhile, back at the physical plant hospital, the news that the tormentor was still at large triggered the worst panic attack Patricia Lawrence had ever experienced during her treatment. When she saw the news report on the TV screen in the hall at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, her reaction was immediate. She hid in a corner of the ward, covering her head with her hands, and began to scream frantically. Doctors had to use sedatives to stop the hysteria. But even in a semi-conscious state, fear gave way to determination. Patricia realized that as long as he was free, she would remain his doll. At 2:30, when the effect of the medication had worn off a bit, she asked for paper. This time, her hand did not tremble. She did not draw abstract lines. She depicted a specific building. It was an old, rickety wooden structure on stilts, with a long pier and a sign. On the sign, Patricia clearly drew a large fishhook with an alligator on it and wrote 2 words, "Gator Hook." Next to it, she drew a gasoline can and a pile of fish. Detective Vance instantly recognized the place. Gator Hook was a legendary, semi-legal bait shop and boat fueling station located on the old Loop Road in the wildest part of the preserve. It was a place where time stood still in the 50s. The owner, an 80-year-old man named Elijah, had lived there for decades, ignoring the laws of civilization. The police rarely came by, knowing that the locals solved their problems themselves. It was the perfect spot for a ghost like Silas Reed. The task force arrived at Gator Hook at 5 o'clock in the evening on November 23. The operation was conducted as quietly as possible. No sirens, no flashing lights. The commandos, disguised as fishermen and tourists, took up positions in the dense bushes around the marina. Vance spoke personally to the shop owner. Elijah, spitting tobacco on the floor, confirmed the investigators' guesses. According to his testimony, "Yes, I know that weirdo. He comes here once every 2 weeks, always at night. He never speaks, only mooing or pointing. He doesn't pay with money. He brings fish, catfish or perch, and exchanges it for gasoline for the generator and canned food. I call him Silent Sam. The last time he was here was 5 days ago. If he runs out of gas, he will come back. The swamp does not forgive an empty tank." The ambush lasted almost a day. The 24th of November was spent in tense anticipation. The heat, humidity, and myriads of mosquitoes tested the patience of the snipers who lay motionless among the mangrove roots. The sun set at 5:30, and the world plunged into pitch blackness, broken only by the dim yellow lights on the store's wharf. At 2 o'clock, 15 minutes in the morning on November 25th, acoustic sensors installed along the canal detected a faint splash. It was not the sound of an engine. It was the sound of a paddle gently cutting through the water. Someone was approaching the pier by boat, turning off the engine to avoid making noise. An Alpha sniper reported through his night vision scope, "I see the target. A flat-bottomed boat with one man on board. It is moving slowly. Description matches the suspect." Silas Reed emerged from the darkness as if he were part of the swamp itself. He was wearing a dirty raincoat, and his long hair was pulled back in a ponytail. The boat bumped softly against the old tires that served as cranes on the dock. Reed was in no hurry to get off. He sat still for several minutes, listening to the night sounds, sniffing out danger like a wild animal. When he was sure that all was calm, he tied up the boat and climbed the stairs to the entrance of the store, where Elijah was napping, having been instructed by the police to behave naturally. But this time, Silas Reed did not come for gasoline or food. He walked up to the counter and placed a crumpled $5 bill on it, a rarity for him. His voice, hoarse from the long silence, sounded like metal scraping. A witness later reported his words verbatim. "Newspapers. All the newspapers from the last week." He was not running away. He was not saving his own skin. He was risking everything to find out if his wife had been found, if the voice he had been working so hard to take away had been returned to her. As he leaned over the stack of fresh press, eagerly peering at the front-page headlines, Elijah's hand quietly pressed the panic button under the counter, signaling the assault. Reed looked up exactly a second before the shadows around him began to move. On November 25, 2015, at 2 o'clock 16 minutes in the morning, the sound of shattering glass broke the silence around the Gatorhook store. The assault began instantly after Elijah pressed the panic button. However, Silas Reed, whose instincts had been sharpened to an animal level over the years of living in the swamps, reacted a split second before the SWAT team burst into the building. He overturned a heavy oak table, blocking the path of the first group of seizure, and rushed not to the main exit, but to the back door leading into the darkness of the mangroves. The escape lasted less than 3 minutes, but its intensity resembled a battle. Reed did not run to his boat. He knew he would be an easy target on the water. Instead, he jumped straight into the thick, viscous silt under the shop's deck, trying to disappear into the reeds. The beams of tactical flashlights cut through the darkness, but the fugitive zigzagged and zagged, using the roots of the trees for cover. The Bravo officer who pursued the suspect later noted in his report, "The object was moving at an unnatural speed for such a viscous surface, as if it knew every bump." At 2 o'clock, 19 minutes, a shot was fired. A sniper monitoring the perimeter from the roof of a neighboring building noticed Reed pulling what looked like a rifle butt from under his coat. The .300 caliber bullet hit the fugitive in the right thigh, knocking him down. Reed fell face first into the black water, but even though he was wounded, he continued to crawl, clinging to the sharp grass with his fingers until 3 officers pinned him to the ground. The detention was harsh. Silas Reed howled like a wounded animal and tried to bite the officer who handcuffed him. When they finally picked him up and dragged him to the patrol car, he started screaming. It was not cursing or begging for mercy. His words, recorded by the police body cameras, referred to only one person. "She forgot her soul," Reed roared, looking with crazed eyes at the camera lens. "She left it in the house. Without the doll, she'll die. You killed her. She's empty inside without my protection." The paramedics administered a sedative to the detainee, and only then did his screams subside, replaced by heavy, raspy breathing. The trial began 6 months later, on May 16, 2016, in the Naples District Court. The case was the most high-profile in the county's history in decades. The courtroom was packed with journalists, but when Patricia Lawrence entered the room, it was dead silent. The woman had changed beyond recognition. She was still very thin, her gait was unsteady, and she leaned on an elegant ebony cane. Her face and hands bore pale scars, the marks of a life in captivity. But her eyes no longer held the animal horror that the doctors had seen in the early days. She looked straight ahead, ignoring the cameras. Silas Reed, who was brought into the room wearing an orange robe and shackles, looked miserable. Without his hair, which had been shaved off in prison, and without his usual environment, he seemed small and withered. Throughout the trial, he sat with his head down and muttered to himself, rocking in his chair. The defense strategy was based on the insanity of the defendant, but the forensic psychiatric examination found him capable of being responsible for his actions. The psychiatrists diagnosed him with a deep personality disorder and manic obsession, but confirmed that he was clearly aware of the criminal nature of his actions. The culmination of the trial came on May 23rd, when the defendant was given the last word. Reed slowly stood up. He did not address the jury or the judge. He turned directly to Patricia. His voice, quiet and squeaky, filled the room. He began to talk about the sanctuary he had created for her, how he had saved her from the din of the world, their happy, quiet life among the water where no one could disturb them. He spoke of her with a tenderness that made my skin crawl, calling her his perfect, obedient companion. At this point, Patricia Lawrence, who had remained silent throughout the hearing, stood up abruptly. The court clerk tried to stop her, but the judge gestured for him to sit down. Patricia rested both hands on the barrier separating her from the murderer and looked him directly in the eye for the first time. Her voice, though a little hoarse, rang out throughout the room, loud, clear, and firm, cutting through the air like a blade. She interrupted his ramblings with just one phrase. "I am not your doll." Those 4 words shattered Reed's fantasy. He froze, mouth agape, as if he had received a physical blow. His face contorted in a grimace of frustration and rage, but he could not say another word. He sat down with his hands over his face. The same day, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges, including kidnapping, torture, and false imprisonment. The judge sentenced Silas Reed to 3 life sentences without parole, to be served in a maximum security prison. The last scene of this drama took place on June 7, 2016, at South Point Pier in Miami. It was a warm evening, and the sun was slowly sinking into the ocean, painting the water crimson. Patricia stood by the railing, where the wind tousled her short hair. In her hands, she held a bag of evidence that she was allowed to take back after the trial. She pulled out the object that had been the symbol of her slavery for 3 years, a doll woven from her own and other people's hair, soaked in tar and pain. The figure was heavy and cold. Patricia stared at it for several seconds, feeling nothing but disgust. Then she swung it sharply and threw it as far as she could into the churning waves of the Atlantic. The doll hit the crest of the wave. The water, salty and merciless, picked up the ball of hair. The powerful current began to erode the resin, tearing the weave. Patricia watched as the dark stain disappeared into the foam, breaking up into thousands of individual hairs that the ocean would take away forever. She took a deep breath of the salty air, feeling her lungs fill with freedom, not fear, for the first time in a long time. Patricia turned around and, leaning on her cane, walked to the parking lot where her new snow-white crossover was parked. She got behind the wheel, feeling the pleasant coolness of the leather under her fingers. She started the engine, a quiet, barely audible sound of modern technology that had nothing to do with the roar of a crusher. She drove onto the highway, merging into the stream of lights of the evening city. Patricia was free. But every few minutes, unconsciously, purely by reflex, her eyes would go up to the rearview mirror. She peered into the stream of cars behind her, looking for the dim dimensions of an old, dirty, dark green pickup truck among the hundreds of headlights. It was not there and could not be. But the ghost of mile 60 was forever at the edge of her vision, reminding her that some doors, once opened, never close completely.